Okay, we're going to begin. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. My name is David Albertson. I'm an associate professor of religion here in USC Dornsife, and also the executive director of the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought, who's sponsoring today's event. This is part of a series funded by the John Templeton Foundation for the In Lumine network, a series of lectures and conversations on science and religion all year. If you're interested, you can visit our website, novaforum.org. Our community explores the rich and long Catholic intellectual tradition in dialogue with the modern university. And if you're interested, you can find out more and follow our social media feeds on the website. Today, we have a guest who's going to be introducing our primary guest speaker, Professor Angela Franks. His name is Father Luke Dysinger. He is a USC alum and also a senior fellow at Nova Forum.
It's my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Angela Franks to what I hope I may call our university. I was sitting this morning in a bench that I first sat in exactly 50 years ago when I first came to the university to look at classes as possibilities for my first year here. Professor Franks is a theologian, a speaker, a writer, and as she emphasizes on her website, a mother of 6. She holds degrees in philosophy and theology from the University of Dallas, Catholic University of America, and Boston College. She teaches, as I mentioned, at St. John's Seminary in Boston, and there she teaches courses in Christology, Trinity, God, theological anthropology, the New Evangelization, Women, Sex, and the Church, Gender and Sexual Differentiation, and Mariology. Her books include Contraception and Catholicism, What the Church Teaches and Why, Margaret Sanger's Eugenic Legacy, The Control of Female Fertility, and her current work and books in progress include The Epiphany of Being, Trinitarian Analogia Entis, and the Transcendentals in Hans Urs von Balthasar, as well as 2 books in process entitled The Body and Identity, the first volume being Liquid Bodies and Empty Selves, and second, Theological and Philosophical Anthropology. Professor Franks will discuss for us today the nature of human memory and narrative in dialogue with the ancient past. She's going to provide us with insights from St. Augustine and other Christian thinkers, showing how that tradition, our tradition, bears on the question of identity and the science of memory. I must add a small amount of envy in that Professor Franks teaches courses similar and in some cases identical to those that I teach at another St. John's Seminary, this one in Camarillo, the Archdiocesan Seminary for Los Angeles. As a celibate male, I have limited capacity to speak on some of the issues that Professor Franks is able to describe in detail in her experience as a mother and as a woman. And perhaps we can conclude, or I'd like to conclude, with an observation that was made just a few days ago by a theologian from Ghana in Africa who exhorted the church, saying, a synodal church must be willing to sit at the foot of women. So perhaps today's talk will provide us an opportunity to do exactly that. Welcome, Professor Franks.
Thank you, Father, and thank you everyone for coming and giving up your lunchtime. I'm really happy to be here, really excited to talk about this topic, which I find extremely interesting. Can you hear me if I walk away from the mic? I'm pretty loud. When I get excited, I get louder. I've been doing a lot of work on identity. I think it's a very interesting, very important topic. You know this from your own experience, right? How much of our culture centers around identity. And so I'm going to look at the kinds of things that neuroscience has to say, in particular the question around identity of narrative and memory. And then I'm going to look at, in particular, St. Augustine and how he provides, he affirms some of the findings of neuroscience, and then he also provides a different angle of, for looking at things. To begin, though, I'm going to provide a distinction between different kinds of identity, which you by and large do not find, actually nowhere do you find that out in the literature. It would greatly help our thinking about identity if we would recognize that the word we use, this one word identity, actually has 3 different meanings. And if you focus on the meanings and not on the word, one of the things that you find is that philosophers and theologians have been thinking about this since people began to philosophize. So even though the word identity, the way we use it, is new, thinking about these topics is not new. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. And so we have a lot of things to process, a lot of historical voices we can look at. The first basic meaning of identity means sameness through time. That I am the same now as I am going to be 5 seconds from now as I was 10 years ago, right? So sameness in time. Philosophers, by and large, use the Aristotelian category of substance to explain this up until the modern times with some variation. I'm not going to explain substance, but I'm happy to address that in questions, if people have questions. The second meaning of identity is what Platonic philosophers called the true self. And the reason that people reflected on this question is because the Delphic oracle posed in a typically oracular, sort of mysterious way, posed this injunction to know thyself. And so the ancient Greek philosophical schools were very interested in the question of who am I? What does it mean to know myself? And so I use this kind of in scare quotes, this language of a true self. Not all of the philosophical schools use the language of true self, but they're all interested in the Delphic oracle. And then lastly, identity 3, the third meaning of identity, is my awareness of identity 2. That awareness might be intellectual, it might be emotional, but what is my sense of myself? That's a third meaning of identity. So let's start with my first major section, looking at this question of narratival identity. We're going to look very quickly at a few philosophers and then a little more at some neuroscience. So in the 17th century, John Locke is the first person to use the word identity to mean my true self, to basically to mean more than sameness through time. Up until that point, that's what everybody used the word identity to mean. John Locke, so you might have heard like the Descartes, if you've studied any philosophy, Descartes thought a lot about consciousness. Trust me, John Locke thought a lot more about consciousness. John Locke is our first real philosopher of consciousness. And for him, identity is a sense of oneself, which means it is a consciousness of myself. The thing about Locke, though, is that he rather famously threw out Aristotelian substance. So the question is, how am I the same person from moment to moment? And he found the answer to that in stringing together the points of consciousness, which means using my memory. So for Locke, I am the same person over time because I have this sense, this memorial sense of myself. I have a memory of myself through time. Okay, that works maybe as long as you're conscious, right? What happens if you're not conscious? And so he actually answers this with a string of kind of wild thought experiments, but it's summarized in this statement where he basically concedes, if I am not conscious, I don't really have an identity. Socrates asleep and Socrates awake is not the same person. So Locke shows us what happens if you go fully on board with consciousness as constituting your identity. Then when you're not conscious, if you're going to be consistent, you have to concede that you are not the same person. So what Locke does in the 17th century, we see, interestingly, even though they're not aware of it, a lot of neuroscientists doing the same thing. Against that background, you have 3 recent philosophers who do not follow Locke in emphasizing consciousness, but who do think that narrative is very important. And so you kind of have going from the top counterclockwise, Alistair MacIntyre, Paul Ricoeur, and Charles Taylor, who all say, without being Lockeans, that an understanding of myself through narrative is necessary for my sense of myself. So here's a quote from MacIntyre. Reflective agents thus increasingly understand themselves and others in terms of a certain kind of narrative, a story in which they as agents direct themselves or fail to direct themselves toward a final end, the nature of which they initially apprehend in and through their activities as rational agents. In other words, just being the kind of people that we are as rational, we create narratives, and that is essential to who we are as human beings. Against kind of following to some degree, but going much more in a kind of Lockean direction, you have contemporary neuroscience. Now, let me say, I know contemporary neuroscience is a very variegated field. So what I'm here doing is summarizing some of the louder popular voices. And I know that this is by no means necessarily representative of all or even most neuroscience scientists. But for popularizing neuroscientists, identity is the necessary narrative that we construct in order to make sense of the memories that we log using our nervous system. So we have memories that we log, we make sense of them through identity. Memory is past consciousness, which is embedded in that tangle of neural pathways, which are constantly forming and reforming. So for neuroscientists, both identity and memory are simply material, meaning that they have to do with our nervous system, with our brain, and with how all of that functions. Something really important to how we form memories with our nervous system is the hippocampus, which is kind of hard to see in that picture, but it's right next to the green almond amygdala, pistachio, maybe we can say. We have two hippocampi. They're bilateral, like almost everything in the brain. They process the sensory signals that come from our senses that are used to create what scientists generally call episodic or sometimes autobiographical memories, right? So a week from now, you'll look back and you'll be like, yeah, that lecture, I don't remember a lot, but I liked the sandwich, right? And that's an episodic memory, right? And it's your hippocampus that enables you to have that memory. As we'll see, those memories are shaded with different things. One of the things memories are shaded with is emotion. And so part of that is the proximity of the amygdala, which is the pistachio there, right up against the hippocampus, which the amygdala helps, is something that is involved with the physical reactions to emotions. And so the emotional flavor of a memory is usually part of an episodic memory. Right? So you'll remember, oh, I was comfortable. Oh, I was happy. Oh, I was irritated at that lecture, right? Because of the proximity of the amygdala. In the hippocampus, neuroscientists have identified place cells in rats that fire. One particular place cell will fire when a rat goes into a particular grid, particular square in a grid. And so this is one reason why our memories are situated within places. We remember places. So this is one neuroscience who says space itself is the scaffold for all episodic memories, the dimension to which every other element of an experience is bound. All of your memories are in some way shaded with place, even if it's very, very vague. So we have place, we have emotion. What about time? We have time in our emotions, but it's experienced as different forms of presence, which is something that Augustine later was going to be very influential, or earlier, sorry. Augustine in the 5th century was very influential in arguing this. In other words, we experience the past as like a past present. We experience the present, obviously, and we experience the future as an anticipated present. Unlike the way we code place, time is not coded. Our memories are not date stamped like our photographs can be, right? The time in memories is a matter of succession. So if you try to remember something that happened roughly 10 years ago, you'll probably figure it out by thinking, okay, it came before I graduated from middle school, but after my boyfriend broke up with me or whatever, so you'll fit it in based on succession. So our time codings for memories are fainter. But we know that what the same neural pathways that we use to remember the past are also used in anticipating the future, right? And so it's part of our memory system, not just to remember the past, but to anticipate the future. So what happens if your hippocampi are damaged? This is how we know how important the hippocampus in part is. So there's a very famous case of Henry Molaison, who had his hippocampi removed because of seizures that he was having a little less than 100 years ago. Dementia can target the hippocampi in particular. Opioid overdose, in particular fentanyl overdose, can blow out the hippocampus, sometimes permanently, and cause very specific neurological damage. And so people who have this kind of damage have a hard time forming episodic memory. So what does this mean? It means that I'm standing here and I'm like, why am I here? What was I doing 2 minutes ago? What am I going to be doing 5 minutes from now? It's like you don't have a sense of continuity. If you have very severe damage, you don't have a sense of continuity in your life. Clive Wearing was a very prominent musician who had, because of seizures, I think, damage to his hippocampi. And he talks about it. He says it's like having no difference between day and night, no thoughts at all. It is precisely like death. So it's very disabling to have damage done to your hippocampus. So what can we conclude about, just from neuroscience, about how important narrative is to us? The temporal vagueness of our memories, the fact that it's coded just in succession, and the orientation of the mind to the future both point to the necessity of the narrative power of our minds to fill in the gaps with a story. Right? We don't remember a story. That's something that we create to fill in the gaps of memories. The most materialistic thinkers, meaning these neuroscientists, interpret this non-optional yet somehow free narratival process as an evolutionary requirement for an odd, meaning-seeking species. So one example is a book that I think just came out, The Self-Delusion. And in the preface, the author poses this question: so who are you? That's an identity 2 question, right? What's your true self? Who are you? The answer is whoever you think you are. That's an identity 3 answer, right? So who you really are, you know thyself, your true self, is who you say you are. And that's a very common answer in kind of the neuroscientific realm. The problem with that answer is that it's assuming that saying something about yourself, in other words, creating a narrative of meaning, operates as the same neurological plane as creating memories, right? We have a pretty good sense of how we neurologically create memories, and we send them to the cortex if we're going to keep them and so forth. But that's assuming that saying something about who you are operates at that same neurological level. There's actually a gap between forming memories neurologically and creating a narrative of meaning. A miraculous gap, in fact, right? Between something new happens. Something new happens when we create a narrative of meaning that makes sense of our memories. So this gap is something that the neuroscientists that I've read are not aware of. They're really just operating on that materialistic level, which is good as far as it goes. But as we're going to see, St. Augustine was very aware of this gap and helps us be a little more sophisticated in thinking about this. So just to summarize where we are now. Memory is bound up in our narratival capacity and is necessary for a full human experience of identity. If you can't create memories, it's very difficult. Memories are rooted in our embodied nature, in particular in the spatial and emotional aspects of our life. Historicity manifests itself in various kinds of temporal presence. And so to quote St. Augustine recognized episodic memory with all of these facets. So he talks about memory being in the palace of memory. In the palace of memory, I also meet with myself and recall myself and where, when, and where, and what I have done and under what feelings, right? So that gets all of the aspects of episodic memory that we saw with neuroscience. But Augustine, as I mentioned, also recognizes that there's more. So here's a longer quote. I turn over in my mind an arch I have seen in Carthage. Maybe that arch, that would be cool. That's an arch from Carthage, so, let's hope. All right, I turn over my mind an arch I have seen in Carthage, embellished with a beautifully intricate pattern. Here a particular thing brought to the mind's notice through the eyes and transferred to the memory produces an observation in the imagination. That's you can 100% translate that into neuroscientific language. Okay, but with the mind, I observe something else. So here's that miraculous gap, right? The jump to meaning, in terms of which I take pleasure in this work of art. Thus it is that we make judgments about these things according to that form of truth, and we perceive that by insight of the rational mind, right? So we don't just have experiences of memory, we're always making judgments, right? Do I like this? Do I not like this? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing, right? And he's recognizing that that happens at this other level. All right, so let's look more closely at what Augustine says about identity and about memory. There's two basic points to talk about here. I'm really only going to talk about the first, but I'll touch a little bit on the second. The first point that Augustine makes is that identity, too, my true self, is primarily something that I receive. It is not primarily a narrative that I construct, though, as we'll see, he thinks constructing a narrative is important. And the second point is that identity 3, or what I think about myself, the very act of thinking about myself has a Trinitarian structure. Trinitarian means reflects the reality of the Christian God, who's Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So let's look in particular at the first point about identity 2. When Augustine, I don't know, has anybody read the Confessions or part of it in any classes? A few of you, yeah. So, one of the common experiences of reading the Confessions is you're like, why is he praying so much? And you're like, can I skip the prayer stuff and get to the content, right? Which is a very, Augustine would appreciate that response because he would have done that too once, right? So what the prayers in the confession are the content. It's just the content expressed in a prayer form. Because what he's trying to show us is that there's really two basic contexts you can have in your life. You can have a context in which God exists, and he's the creator, or you can have a context in which you create yourself. That's obviously simplifying things a good bit, but Augustine used to be in the context of he was creating himself, and the Confessions narrate how he converts to this other context. And central to this Judeo-Christian context is the idea that God is creator, which he comes back to over and over again. And that means for Augustine that God is both transcendent and immanent. God totally transcends the world. God does not have a body. He's not material. He's not in a place. He's not some ghostly gas of a thing. He's not material at all. That was very important to his conversion. But because God is so transcendent, that means he can be truly immanent, truly interior within creation, because he's not located in any one place. Right? This podium can only be in one place at once because it's just a thing in the world. It doesn't transcend the world. But God can be everywhere because he transcends. And so this is part of the prayer stuff in the Confessions. Are you not everywhere in your whole being? Well, there is nothing whatever that can hold you entirely. So if we look at this alternative that I laid out, right? So either we're self-made persons, really like the contemporary neurosciences say, right? Who are you? You are the narration you make for yourself. That is saying that identity 2 really is only identity 3. Who are you? You're the story you tell about yourself, which is really what Augustine lived. right? So, I mean, Augustine knew all of our temptations. He had this career path. He was going to be a brilliant rhetorician and work for the Roman Empire. It was like, you go to the best schools, you get into USC, right? You get a job, you make lots of money, right? He had that kind of materialistic career path. That really was the first point. After his conversion, he had this change of heart where he recognized, oh, actually, I am created, which means that God gives me identity too. And my identity 3 job is a matter of discovering that as opposed to creating it. He gives us a lot of examples of what it was like. So this is actually a statue called Self-Made Man. It's like he's like chiseling his hip there or something like that. I don't know where it is exactly. But he had a lot of experience in this self-making, and a lot of the confessions are his accounting of it. And so what is it like to think you can make it yourself? He says it means you get immersed in the world of things. The mind can act as though it has forgotten itself, meaning its status as mind, as something above things in the world, and becomes swallowed up in what is less than itself. So it turns away from God and slithers and slides down into less and less, which is imagined to be more and more. It can find satisfaction neither in itself nor in anything else as it gets further away from him who alone can satisfy it. So this idea that when I get immersed in the world of things, when I get far away from God, one thing that happens is that I do not know myself. Okay, that's part of Augustine's point and part of our relevant to our question of identity. So he talks about this in terms of dispersion. The mind loses itself in the inferior things outside of itself, right? Like how many times can you stare at a phone before like you kind of get sucked into the phone, right? Like Augustine would totally recognize that, right? There's like I am now outsourcing myself to this phone, right? Like I'm losing myself. And it's a kind of love, right? He talks about the weight of love or of carnal habit, that weight pulls it away from God instead of turning inward, which is where you find God. This dispersion of the mind, he argues, forces it to be conformed to inferior things because you're always thinking about inferior things. So you get more and more thing-like the more you think about inferior things. He calls this a shameful mistake that leads the mind to be present to what is outside of it rather than present to itself in its interior. And then this impacts how he thinks and feels about himself. Whither could my heart flee to escape itself? Like he can't stand himself, but he can't get away from himself. Whither could I flee myself? Where would I not be followed by myself? My good is to hold fast to God, for if I do not abide in him, I shall not be able to abide in myself, right? So how he acts vis-a-vis God impacts how he thinks and feels about himself. A human being on his own can make of himself only a land of empty lack. So the Augustine scholar John Cavadini talks about how the Confessions revealed the sadness or even pity of someone who has haplessly, if culpably, paid out his whole self to purchase nothing, and now has no leverage to get it back. So in the sense of being dispersed, of being empty, of kind of hating himself but not being able to get away from himself, so he has this conversion experience, and what that does for him is it's in part an experience of unity instead of dispersion. And so he prays, preserve the trace in me of your profoundly mysterious unity from which I came. He can only feel like a unified self if he turns to God. And so this is from a very early work of his, this prayer, God ever the same, may I know myself, may I know you. So again, he feels like he cannot know himself unless he knows God. But if he knows God, he can know himself. He can do this, he can know God at all because of this very famous Augustinian idea that God is more interior to him than he is to himself. So remember, if you think that idea of God as creator, as transcendent and immanent, God is really can be found within. But he has to pause and he has to be present to himself to find him. So he finds, he argues, he has found, that's the experience of the Confessions, his true self in God. What is hearing about oneself from you, if not knowing oneself, he writes. You, Lord, know everything about a human being because you have made him. Because God is creator, I can reliably find myself by finding God in myself. But it's hard. And so this is an interesting part of Augustine's writing, is that he realizes how hard it is to know himself. I do not know what kind of man I am. I'm an enigma to myself, right? So it's hard. But that's confusing. Why should it be hard? Because he says the mind is always present to itself. The mind is a spiritual reality. Like, it can't go anywhere. So how is it that I can't know myself? And so this is where memory comes in for Augustine. That memory is how you can access yourself. But memory for Augustine has a wider meaning than memory has for us or for the neuroscientists. We saw that Augustine recognizes episodic or autobiographical memory, which is the stuff that the neuroscientists explain very well. But that there's also this intellectual level of memory, right? It's not just having episodic memories, but it's a matter of making a story of meaning, which happens at the level of the mind. And so for Augustine, being present to yourself is an act of memory. He calls this turning toward the deepest part of yourself, which he thinks is also where you'll find God. And so the beginning point for Augustine for memory is this pause, this turning toward oneself. When he describes the palace of memory, he wants us to understand that it's not an actual place, even though he uses all of these spatial metaphors. So it has fields and vast mountains, a vast and infinite inner sanctum, but he also says it's not a place, right? So it's not your cortex. Right? Even though if you damage your cortex, you're going to have a hard time accessing those episodic memories. But your memory is more, it's not a specific place. It's this ability to turn to yourself and make sense of the whole using those episodic memories. So that's where God is found, at there, right? But it's not a place at all because God isn't material. For Augustine, the memory is the means by which we recall our desire for eternal happiness, right? Our true desires. It's that self-presence to our deepest desires, which can only be fulfilled in God. And therefore, that's where we can turn our attention to God. So just briefly about identity 3, as we turn toward ourselves, for Augustine, this is in the image of the Trinity. And he describes these 3 acts of memory, of knowing, and of loving. And he says, in particular, it's helpful to understand these as remembering, knowing, and loving myself, right? So when I am my own object, right? So I'm not thinking about the tree, I'm not thinking about the hippocampus, I'm just thinking about myself. Then this is closest to the Christian Trinity. We have these 3 acts of memory, knowing, and loving, and that these resemble the Christian Trinity. What I want to focus on is the memory, because in Augustine's account of things, this lines up with the first person of the Trinity, the Father. And why would he say that? Okay. Oops, did I just turn it off? I did. Fortunately, it turns back on. All right. So he wants us to view memory as generative. You could say, reproductive. That's really modern language, but he would say generative. So to help us understand this, when the Christian Trinity uses the names Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Father sounds male, right? Because all of the fathers we know, those are male human beings or maybe male animals. That is not what it means in Christianity. Because as Augustine had to come to, as part of his conversion, God does not have a body. Maleness refers to embodied animals, right? You have male and female, or you have male and female bodies. So So God doesn't have a body. So we're not saying that God is male. Okay, so what are we saying? Why is the language of Father appropriate? I mean, the basic Christian answer is we use the names Father, Son, and Holy Spirit because those are what are given in Scripture. But like, how can we understand this better? What I think it's pointing to is the fact that fathers generate in a particular way. Namely, they generate outside of their bodies, outside of themselves. Right? So the way that male generativity works is this generation outside of oneself. Meaning that the child that a father generates is truly other than the father. Now, obviously, the child that the mother generates is other than the mother, but it really doesn't feel like that for a long time, right? You know, the child's in my womb for 40 weeks, you know, but even we know even just chemically that the kind of bonds between mother and child are like very tight. From the beginning, and that fathers can generate those kinds of bonds even chemically, but it takes longer and you have to work at it. And so this is why, you know, all of the tropes in literature and in psychology, which are all true about how damaging it can be when fathers are irresponsible. Why is it so easy for a father to be irresponsible? Because he can walk away. Right? Literally, he can walk away. He's not the one who's pregnant. So you get the quoted Taylor Swift song, right? Talking about a bad boyfriend, of course, right? An unfaithful boyfriend, that he's leaving like a father, running like water, right? That's much harder to say about a mother, right? Like a mother has to work a lot harder to walk away. Okay, so like this is the negative side of fatherhood, right? This is what happens when fatherhood is not healthy and the way flourishing the way it's supposed to be. But the capacity of the father to give space is precisely the kind of thing that makes the Christian father, if you look at that in a good, if you reframe it now and it's not abandonment, what's good about generating outside of yourself? You're really giving the other a space to be. Right? You're really giving the other freedom. And we even see this in kind of more male typical parenting compared to female typical parenting, where the male's more likely to like push the kid to like leave the house and do risky things and stuff. Like there's this ability when you generate outside of yourself, you're really giving space to be. And that's the experience that Augustine experienced vis-a-vis God, the Father, right? That God, the Father, gave Augustine lots of space. Augustine did all kinds of things that were not what God wanted him to do. And so this giving space means that God gives us this space to be ourselves and to learn who we are, right? And that's the positive aspect of the freedom that he gives us. All right, so I want to just tie things together now and bring it back to the question of identity and narrative and what maybe Augustine can help us see. So first of all, Augustine helps us recognize that identity is primarily received and also generated. So that generative power of our memory, the way we image the Christian father, is that we generate insights. We do this constantly. We generate narratives. I guarantee 100% of you walked into this room with a narrative, maybe not spelled out, but some kind of implicit narrative maybe about where you came from, where you're going, what your life story is about. That's what we do as human beings. We have this generative memory, right? So we are always doing that. And what Augustine realized is that this generation of narrative needs to receive, but it really does engage our human powers. I mean, Augustine wrote a whole book, which is a literary classic, about the narrative that he was generating from our memory. So the fact that we receive an identity does not mean that that stamps out our human powers, but that it engages them. I did it again. All right, so here's a quote from one of the theologians I study. I love this picture, by the way. That's by Magritte. I think that is a great picture. And the theologian Hans von Balthasar writes us a little bit about receiving. You can translate it to the question of receiving an identity, analogous to an artist being inspired by an artistic idea. The artist is never more free than when, no longer hesitating between artistic possibilities, he is, as it were, possessed by the true idea. So think like my true self, my identity, that presents itself to him in finite form, sort of from the outside, right? Artistic inspiration. They have this aha. And he follows its sovereign commands. The work that results will bear the utterly personal stamp of the artist in absolute clarity. That receiving from the outside doesn't mean that it's not personal, that it doesn't engage my powers. But in fact, that's really when my powers are most engaged. But the way that we receive an idea and generate ideas are stretched out in time, right? We live in history, we live in space, and so we need to generate an identity in the form of a narrative. And so this is where those philosophers that I alluded to at the beginning are absolutely correct. The neuroscientists are correct. We have to generate identity narratives. We're constantly doing that. The question is, though, are they good ones? Right? Are they good ones? I mean, I can guarantee you Hitler had an identity narrative, right? And he had a historical narrative too, right? Like we have to have some criteria for judging, are they good narratives? Augustine says, yes, we need a criterion, and that criterion is God's creative love. It's interesting that very few, I read a lot of philosophers on identity, very, very few, none that I've encountered, have a good sense of what our criteria for an identity narrative should be. But even though we have to generate a narrative and it needs to be a good one, we are still more than our narratives. Our narratives are very important, but what happens if we get dementia, right? What happens if we lose the ability to generate a coherent narrative? I think it's really important to recognize that we are not just that identity 3 narrative, but that there's a true self that really is there, right? That you really love when you love your grandmother with dementia, right? That's still really there. So identity 2 exists even when identity 3 cannot, for whatever reason. So Jen, just to summarize what I'm doing here then, and then we'll go to questions. Narratival identity. We perpetually generate identity narratives. That's identity 3. This is part of memory, as Augustine says, it's part of being created in the image of God. It's a good thing that we generate identity narratives. Personal identity, though, if you think in terms of our true self, that is not something we generate, right? We're not actually carving out our hip bone, right? We're given into existence. And so personal identity is received. And the whole truth of one's identity, Augustine shows us, is a confession of the loving creator. That's the Augustinian answer, that the whole truth is a confession of the loving creator, which means a confession of my true self. So that's what I have to present. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Everyone, if you have a question, come up to this mic over here and ask a question.
Take a seat. Minte, you want to get the lights too? I know it's really far away. If you're really far away and you don't want to walk to the mic, I can repeat your question.
Yeah. I'm really interested in networks and memory and because he does not follow like scientific reductionism. Maybe thinking what's memory, and Deleuze takes him further think of memory as a form of intensity.
Memory is a form of
Intensity. So I'm wondering if you were exposed to his work or what you think of his work. But also the Deleuzian interpretation is quite different in the work of Bergson himself. So I'm not sure, like, what do you think of Bergson's position in this idea of memory and what he thinks of? And yeah, if you have we can connect his work within our groups.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm repeating for the Zoom people. Thank you for that question. The question was about Bergson, so you can tell me if I get this wrong, about Bergson's work on memory and connected to that Deleuze and how Bergson views memory in terms of intensity. And does that sound good? Yeah. Thank you. I don't know Bergson very well. I mostly know him through Deleuze, which is a little iffy because, as one Bergson specialist said, it was a bastard child of Bergson, but as the scholar said, I adopted it and brought him up as my own. It was so great. Deleuze tended to do that. Spinoza and Leibniz and arguably Nietzsche, yes. So, I mean, honestly, I think Deleuze's ontology is the most compelling alternative to Christian ontology. I really do. And so that's one reason why I engage it, because I think it's like worth engaging. I mean, so basically, if you know Spinoza at all, I mean, he basically takes Spinoza and kind of injects him with Nietzsche and Bergson, which is, so like, everything is this one immanent field that is not transcendent at all. It's not even a field of any depth. It's all on the surface. He says, he quotes Valéry, I think, there's nothing deeper than the skin, right? So everything's on the surface, and it's like any depth is a matter of folds. And so I think, not specifically in the question of memory, but in terms of his ontology as a whole, I just think the ontology reduces us, as he freely admits, to different intensities of this one voice of being. So I do not have a voice, really. It's an illusion that I do. It's the after effect, kind of the residue, but I do not really have a voice. I just am one kind of manifestation of this field of being that sort of appears and then dissolves. So I think in the end, it is not a human affirming position, which I think he would acknowledge. I don't think he wants it to be. And I would just, I mean, for our purposes, I would counter that by saying that does not, I mean, from an Augustinian perspective, that does not make sense of the deepest desires of the human heart, which are a lot more than being this kind of epiphenomenon of the field of being that comes and passes away. And we sense that in our real, in our deepest desires, and that you can have an account of the world that makes sense of those desires instead of denying them. And that's what I think Augustine does.
It's just a higher form of instinct or a more complex form of
Yeah.
that allows, because the whole idea of the privilege that
Right.
emerged out of the brain of immanence
Right.
in another level is actually about the question of how complex is the assemblage. So maybe the complexity of the human as an assemblage it would allow
Us to have these deep
creation
desires.
of the
Yeah. Yeah, so the argument being that you have these assemblages out of this one field of being that can be very complex, and that could be the explanation for the desires. I mean, there's no way of proving a fortiori the Deleuzian ontology compared to an analogical Christian ontology. Like that, it is an account for our desires. I think that it still does not make sense of the deepest human experiences, which is that we're a lot more than this is, like that there really is something unique and distinctive about each human person. I do think that Christianity will prove to be the last defender of the unique dignity of each human person. I think that our world is going more in the Deleuzian direction. So yeah, I'll just end it with that. But thank you for the question. I love talking to Liz, actually. Good.
I'll just give you the question if you can repeat it anyway.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for this really interesting reconstruction of Augustine's questions and bringing us to this topic of conversion. And that's where my question lies here. You gave us this wonderful example about the grandmother with dementia, the true self still existing. But I wonder, in the context of what you've been talking about, if we have a person whose neurological apparatus is damaged, episodic memories are no longer possible, conversion, therefore, is no longer possible. Can you speak to the theological implications of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's almost a philosophical question. What happens when your brain or parts of your neurosystem might be so damaged that you can't form episodic memories, and is conversion still possible? So philosophically, in the tradition that I'm in, because thinking is not strictly speaking material, right? You can't take a picture of a thought. You can't weigh it or measure it. It's not strictly speaking material. You can take pictures of your brain functioning. That there is a certain independence of thinking from the bodily structures, but only a certain independence, because we use our images, and that means the things that our memory has formed, and so all the things that our brain and our nervous system does, we use all of that in thinking. So for example, many of us think using words, like even if we don't say it, like there's some kind of linguistic construction going on in our minds very often, and that depends upon all of those neurological things being present. I think it's possible to learn to think without that, but I think it's probably very difficult. So I think it would depend on the amount of damage that a person, if a person is in a coma, for example, like there's a lot that's very mysterious about being in a coma that I really don't think we know exactly what's going on as far as consciousness and self-consciousness and all of that. For an active conversion, you do have to have a kind of baseline level of self-consciousness so that you can say, I, right? Like you have to have some sense of yourself that you're committing to God for a conversion. But I think that baseline could be very low. And I think that there's a lot that we don't know about things that don't rise to the level of verbal consciousness, that are very hard to test for experimentally. So I don't want to rule it out, but I would say it is difficult to know what people can do without being able to have some sense of themselves, at least. Thank you. That's a good question. Anybody studying neuroscience? Okay.
I have a question from Zoom.
Oh, great.
He says, if possible, could Professor Frank speak to the cloud of unknowing, Father Thomas Keating's false self and true self in terms of St. Augustine's concept of true identity? They all embody that the true self comes from the Creator and divine meaning, the triune God, or the beloved Lord. Are you familiar with this Father Thomas Keating?
I'm not familiar with the book, so I can't speak to that directly. So the question's about the true self and the false self. Is that, yeah. Yeah, so I think, that's the part that I, roughly in the middle of the talk, as far as, that we can have an erroneous understanding of ourselves, even if it's not conceptualized, even if it's not something we could like write down, post as our profile on Instagram or something. We all have some kind of inchoate understanding of ourselves, and very often that involves like what's closest to hand. So like, who am I? I am a successful student who's destined for, a successful career. That's I think a very common sense of self. Augustine would say, okay, what happens if you're no longer, in school? What happens if you get fired from your job? What happens if you decide you hate the thing you're studying and want to do something totally different, right? So like it's the things that we often use to construct our sense of self tend to be pretty superficial and tend to be rooted in our more superficial desires, you know, which are not bad desires. They're just kind of superficial, you know, for pleasure and comfort. I mean, all of that's good, but it's not getting at kind of the deepest parts of ourselves. So anytime we make a narrative based on those, which are kind of rooted more in our superficial desires, it's going to be a false narrative as opposed to what God has in mind for us, which might involve doing the same things. You know, God might want you to be a successful lawyer. I don't know, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you're even doing something different, but you're understanding yourself in a different way.
As a philosopher, I'm struck by the question that you raised with regard to dimension. Let's follow up here. In the past, it would have been possible to invoke a form of metaphysics to describe the possibility of a self or an existence that existed in relationship to God that was not dependent on its physical structure. Do you, as a philosopher, find that there is anything that can either substitute for or allow that kind of narrative to continue, to even raise the question, can there be a self apart from the existence of my neurons and so forth?
Yeah.
Because, of course, the doctrine of resurrection says there is,
Yeah.
and the fact that we treat a person with dignity as a human being, even though they may have reached a point where one can no longer define how that individual can be regarded as having identity. Do you find anything useful for discussion?
Yeah. So the question is more on the philosophical understanding of the self, related to the question of, you know, what happens when you have dementia or what happens when you die. And so, like, you know, life after death and so forth. What is, and so these are really identity one questions. In other words, what is the baseline? What's necessary for there to be a constant self? I mean, you know, our material selves, like our cells and so forth, are turning over. I don't forget how many times over the course of a life, but it's not like there is a sameness to our body, but there's also a lot of change in our body that kind of undermines that sameness. And obviously our bodies themselves change considerably over the course of our life. So yeah, that's where the idea of substance comes in as an explanation. And substance, like Locke thought substance meant like this concrete block under which, you know, that kind of is underneath everything. That's sort of this like static, heavy thing that he was like, I don't even know what this is doing. Can't we pretend that the building is there without this block, right? Like he was kind of metaphysically tone deaf, Locke. Like it was like, there's a tune there that he just was incapable of hearing. The point of what substance retains is that when we say I, you know, so I am a woman, right? Womanness is not something that just exists on its own. We're like, hey, womanness, there it is. Wow. No, it's like individual women, right, is what we know of womanness, which means that that womanness is a quality that inheres in something. What's that something? Well, the answer to that something was substance. In other words, that substance makes sense of the fact that I can be an agent. I will talk, then I will sleep, then I will eat. Well, who's doing the talking? It's not like talking just exists. Deleuze kind of thought it did, right? But, you know, greening is the thing that happens next to the tree, right? But I think most of us think, well, no, it's trees that green, right? Like green is a quality of trees. It's not this independent thing that exists. And so substance helps us make sense of that. It's part of my argument that when we ditch, as a kind of in our philosophical history, when we ditch substance, that what we wind up with are empty selves, that's the practical payout, which Locke did not intend, but that's the practical payout of ditching metaphysical substance, of ditching identity 2. So of only getting identity 3, now we have Socrates asleep and Socrates awake are not the same person. And but the real practical problem is we get what people have called a culture of narcissism, because the psychological correlate of an empty self is the narcissist, which is not the person who thinks a lot about themselves. They do, but they do that because they don't know who they are. And so they have to think a lot about themselves because it's like this empty middle that they're always circling around trying to, and people like that cause a lot of damage and they suffer themselves, right? And so like we have a kind of fallout by emptying out the self that actually has very real practical consequences, which Augustine tasted, right? He definitely, that sense of, I don't know who I am and I hate myself and I can't get away from myself. And it's just like, that's part of that kind of circling around the empty self. Yeah. So philosophy matters, people, says the philosopher. Yeah.
So in finding the true self, what would Augustine say is the best way to do that? Is it go alone into the caves and the mountains and find God within? Is it do it in community with others? Is it some balance between the two?
Yeah, Augustine had a lot of friends. And so Augustine, even in his moment of conversion, we sometimes forget this, there's somebody else right there with him, like right next to him. He's like crying and stuff, and the friend is probably like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. But like Augustine does it in community, even though he definitely sees a place for solitude and having that time of quiet. I mean, the benefit of solitude, and in particular silence, is that it facilitates that self-presence, right? So one reason why, I'm not the first person by any means to observe this, one reason why we have such a noisy world is we don't want to come face to face with our empty selves. That's really the truth of it. I mean, in a sense, we're all kind of on that narcissistic spectrum where we've got selves that we're not sure what's there, if anything. And so we have a very noisy world to distract us. And the noise is coming more and more and more kind of invading our inner space. Or it's really possible to kind of go through a day without ever having, but like you can be constantly entertained if you want in our world, right? That is 100% possible, constantly entertained. You can have your phone in your shower. I've seen stuff like waterproof phone holders for your shower. Like, you're gonna Zoom in the shower? I think that's a bad idea. So I mean, definitely the benefit of silence is that it enables that self-presence to confront oneself and to get closer to accessing God within oneself. But that's not the same thing as living a solitary life. And I think Augustine would strongly advocate for the importance of human community and friendship because your friends can, your friends can really help you if you choose the right friends. Your family is probably even better at this, right? Of like helping you recognize your true self, which might not be as shiny and pretty as we want it to be, right? Like, oh, wow. I think maybe that has to change a little. Like it's good friends and family who are more likely to help us see where we're failing. Because they're more likely to also see who we really are. Right, to view us through love and have a glimpse of the person God wants us to be. And so they're the ones who can help us move away from the stuff that's keeping us from that and move toward the thing that, is the people we're supposed to be. Thank you. It's a great question.
I actually have a question. Two questions that may or may not be related. The first one is, what you said and how it relates to the more psychological or psychiatric mention of one of the main points that people like Freud or you might make is that we have suppressed memories and they can affect in certain ways identity 3 and you might even say like identity 2 in certain people's cases. So how does that, what do you think Augustine would say to things like that? So that's question number one. About the role of submerged or suppressed memory and how we can deal with that. The other one is how I think contemporary society is filled with or forces us to make narratives of ourselves even when we don't want to. Like college entrance essays, you have to tell a story about why you're such a brilliant, nice person, creative, whatever. at every step of the way, like from college to like grad school, job interviews, what have you. It forces us to make memories and like make narratives, and oftentimes it forces us to exaggerate or even embellish large parts of our identity. And I think you said something to the effect of Augustine sees this as making people slide down in terms of our minds, but yeah, how else do you think it's might be relevant, or how other effects might be coming out from this societal impulse to make everyone have it?
Yeah, thank you. So just quickly, I hope, to the first question. I think Augustine realizes that, in my terms, that identity 2 is more than identity 3. So consciousness is really identity 3. Like what I'm conscious of, like what I'm, the thing that I know, that it can be deeply mistaken, and he knows that. But it also can just, it might not be through any failing, it just is limited. And so I don't think he'd have any problem with repressed memories or anything like that, because like, it's a mystery what's in that treasure house, and we can't just, he spends a lot of time talking about the fact that we can't just pull up what we want, as you know, when you've sat in a test and you're like, I can see it on my notebook page and I can't remember it, right? Like he understands that. As far as kind of this narcissistic pressure in our society, which is really very real, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that it is not a bad thing to have an identity narrative, that in fact it is inescapable. And so the question is, again, how good of a narrative is it? And how much do I think my narrative is creating me? And how much do I recognize that I'm just trying to do justice to what God wants me to be, right? Like those are two different places to be. And I think it's a very typical narcissistic impulse to think, like the neuroscientist said, like I am made by my narrative. I am made by, it's called narcissistic supply, by the like pretty women that I have by me and the fancy cars or whatever, like that's a very common narcissistic thing to say, that self-creation really makes me. So we want to avoid that temptation, but I don't think it's a bad thing to have a narrative. And I think it can be actually a really helpful spiritual exercise to be like, what should I emphasize about myself? And try not to exaggerate or tell lies. What's really true about myself? It doesn't mean you tell everybody everything, which is the other problem in our society, but I don't have a problem. Like, I think it's really important to be convicted of the fact that God wants me to be an individual person that is unique and unlike anybody else. That's not something I came up with. That's something God came up with by creating me a spiritual being. And so God is not the enemy of our identities. He's our friend in that regard. So I think that's can be helpful to keep us from feeling sort of icky when we do this stuff.
Maybe a last question.
Sure.
Thank you for the talk. It was really helpful in these distinctions I'm still thinking inside of. I was really struck by the way that Augustine talks about crisis, the level of identity 3, but also the need, like the necessity and the positivity of generating narratives to sustain identity 3. And that matches philosophical perspectives from people like Taylor and McIntyre that you quoted. What about identity 2, and what are the ways in which it's received? It seems like that's the difficult border, is like which aspects of human experience are narrated at that identity 3 level, and what are some ways that we think about identity 2 being received more passively?
Yeah, I should add, I don't talk about it in the talk, but there's also a lot of psychologists who've done work on the importance of having a good narrative and how people, so like kind of the postmodern kind of fractured self and multiple self, like those are actually pathologies. Like we know what that looks like, and those people are not happy and they suffer and they make other people suffer. But so like we want to have a narrative and we want it to be a healthy narrative. But then how is that related to identity 2? So for, Augustine's emphasis on God as creator means that we are made, like he talks, as do all of the people in the Christian tradition pretty much, talks about the divine ideas, meaning that God has ideas for creation that are identical with God himself. And that therefore, this is expressed in the Christian doctrine of providence. Like God has an idea, for example, about the history of the world. Like there's a narration for the history of the world, not just for us. And so the goal is to align ourselves more and more and more with the idea that God already has of us. So these ideas are eternal. They like pre-exist us. They like from before the world even began, God had an idea of me. And like the best way to think of it is like the particular saint that God wants me to be. Like what does holiness for me, what does unity with God for me look like? It'll involve doing stuff, but it's not just a matter of doing stuff, it's a matter of being. So knowing that, so because we, unlike God, are not living in eternity, because we're stretched out in time, we're constantly generating narratives, but ideally we're constantly trying to come to a better and better sense of what that plan for me is. And so traditionally in the Catholic tradition, this will involve things like spiritual direction. It'll involve things like retreats, getting away and kind of letting everything get quiet and sort of thinking about the important stuff. Things like examinations of conscience, like, oh, actually, I'm really selfish. Like, look at that. I am really selfish. I'm just thinking about myself all the time. Wow. And then it's like, okay, if I bring that to God and let him forgive it and try to live differently, what does that look like? What does it look like for me not to be selfish? And so it's like a lot of those ascetical practices of silence and, some self-denial. Maybe I don't just indulge, every whim that I can just because I can afford it. Maybe I deliberately, nothing sinful per se, but maybe I just don't get the $10 smoothie or whatever for a day and, kind of put some distance between me and my desires and see what I see. Like, what do I see? Where is God calling me? And so I think there's all of those, I think it's all of those ascetical practices that are a matter of, in the Ignatian tradition, of discerning God's plan. But I think even outside the Ignatian tradition, all of the Christian spiritualities are really centered around that goal of discernment. You're welcome. Thanks, everyone. You guys are really patient. Do you want to, yeah, sure. One last question. Do we have time? Okay.
So what kind of it could be identity to apply when we go through the spiritual exercises from San Ignacio of Loyola?
Okay, good. So is that the question? Yeah, so the question is identity too related to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola? Yeah, I think St. Ignatius is really deeply interested in the question of what kind of saint does God want me to be? And a lot of the Ignatian practices are centered around that. I mean, ultimately, as with Augustine, we want to know who I am, identity too, because we want to praise God and grow closer to God. So it's in the end, it's not about me, it's about God. But what we find is that when we live like that, we get ourselves as a bonus. Like Augustine, when Augustine tried to live fulfilling himself, he lost himself. But if you live focused on God, we get ourselves in return. And so, I think that's very much a big part of the Ignatian program, to kind of understand ourselves as God's creatures, and then what does that mean for my life? Yeah, thank you.
Please help me thank Professor Franks for this wonderful talk.